Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on chronic diseases. We have quite a few chronic diseases to cover today, and I know this isn't always the most exciting topic and may feel like it has even a little bit of doom and gloom, but it's a really important one when it comes to talking about our overall health and well-being, and we'll aim to highlight some strategies that can reduce your risk of developing chronic disease and improve your health and well-being long-term. Let's dive in. So we're going to cover the leading chronic diseases in the United States. We'll understand the primary risk factors, both within and without of our control for these diseases and conditions. And then we'll outline the strategies that we can use to reduce our risk of developing these chronic diseases to live a longer, healthier life. So what exactly are chronic diseases? What are we referring to when we say this? These are diseases that generally develop gradually, often without our even noticing, and last years, months to years or more, and require continual ongoing medical interventions. So it's not something like a cold or a flu or another disease that you contract from another person. These are things that develop in your own life, often from lifestyle behaviors. And these are often referred to as lifestyle diseases because of that. These diseases are contributed to by things like smoking, excessive alcohol use, poor diet, and lack of physical activity. So the main key here is that these are conditions that develop gradually via these changes that build up in the body because of not treating our bodies too well. And you can actually see when you look at the top 10 leading causes of death from the early to the late 1900s, how dramatically these shifted, partly because of some great public health interventions that saved a lot of lives from the common communicable diseases that were the major leading causes of death then, and also in part because of our changing environment, culture, technology, and food availability has made our behaviors different as well. So in the early 1900s, the leading causes of death were considered communicable diseases. These are diseases like viruses, bacteria, and other pathogens that are transmitted from person to person. You can see here, pneumonia and tuberculosis were the leading causes of death in 1900, and these are not anywhere on our top 10 list now. You saw even things like diarrhea and enteritis, so other gut and bacterial infections could lead to death. You did see some things like heart disease and stroke, but they're lower on the list, and even things like cancer. Now we have a complete reversal of this, where our leading causes of death are these chronic lifestyle related diseases, the biggest of which being heart disease. And we'll cover heart disease in its various forms today. You also see things like cancer, stroke, and diabetes that we're going to look at in this lesson. So why this matters so much is that chronic diseases account for 70% of the annual deaths in the United States. Now, that number may have shifted a little bit during the year, the times of COVID, but generally speaking, without that big burst in communicable disease that we saw, typically 7 out of 10 deaths, or 70% of the deaths in the United States, come from these chronic diseases. Additionally, chronic physical and mental conditions make up 90% of our huge, almost 4 trillion, or I should say trillion annual in healthcare expenses. And these things impact both our lifespan and our health span. So not only are they shortening the years that we have, but they're impacting the quality of those years as well. So lifespan is how long you live. Health span is the number of quality, healthy years that you have. And you want those to be as close together as possible. You want that gap to be nice and narrow. So the current statistics as it stands right now in 2021 is that 6 in 10 adults in the United States have some kind of chronic disease, so over half. And 4 in 10, or getting close to half, have 2 or more chronic conditions. And oftentimes these chronic conditions end up overlapping with one another because they have similar underlying mechanisms in the body, which we'll talk about. So what conditions are we talking about here? Well, you can see on the left the ones that we're going to cover in today's lecture, and you can see on the right here the leading causes of death globally. Globally, this is not just in the United States, but globally. And you can see that even outside of the US, some of the major factors are non-communicable or lifestyle chronic conditions. So again, we see that heart disease is still the biggest killer worldwide. Stroke, which is considered a cardiovascular disease because it is related to your blood vessels, even though it impacts the brain. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is a lung condition. Then we see things like lung infections or neonatal conditions or infections. Worldwide, we still do have this burden of communicable diseases that are lower here in the United States, but still, of course, a factor. And then we see things like lung and other cancers, Alzheimer's disease and dementia, both of which are considered chronic lifestyle diseases. Diarrheal diseases and infections are communicable disease. So that's because of some parasite, bacteria, or other pathogen that gets ingested. And then we see diabetes and kidney disease, which are also chronic communicable chronic non-communicable conditions. So this is a big deal. We're covering these things because not only will they impact your longevity, how many years you have on the planet, the longevity of your loved ones, but also how healthy you are during that time. So let's take a step back and look at the risk factors for the development of all chronic diseases, rather than looking at diabetes by itself and cardiovascular disease by itself and cancer by itself. We're going to look at some of the factors that contribute to the development of all of these conditions. And that's why you see that 2/3 of people in the United States who have one chronic disease have two or more. That's because these conditions and diseases have similar underlying mechanisms. So if we look all the way out at the underlying socioeconomic, cultural, and political environments that we live in. If you think way back to our first lecture on the socio-ecological model, it's that biggest, broadest level, the environmental or public policy level that impacts all of our well-being. And these are things like globalization, urbanization, and an aging population. So the aging population is in part because we've gotten so good at reducing the risk of communicable disease-related death, especially in the United States. That means we're better at hand washing and other hygiene practices. We have antibiotics, which means that we can treat things that would have in the past led to death. Our population is aging because of that, which allows chronic diseases more time to manifest. We also see urbanization and globalization, which means that our population is becoming bigger. There are more people. There are changes because of that. And there are changes in the way that people live their lives. So there's more density among populations, and we're living in more urban environments where we have more technology. We have access to more and less nutritious food, more food that's less nutritious. We have less access to things like fruits and vegetables that are locally grown or right near us. And then we have an increase in things like cars, automobiles, planes, and other ways to get around that don't involve active transportation. So our environment reduces our need for physical movement and increases the availability of non-nutritious food sources that contribute to the development of chronic disease. Here are some personal modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors. So we're going from this kind of like global trend, what we see happening, an increase in the number of fast food restaurant availability, an increase in the access to less nutritious food, less availability of places to be physically active or safe ways to do so, or the need to be active during work, all the way down to how this impacts us personally. So we see an unhealthy diet. So that's diet involving high levels of ultra processed food. So that could be things like processed meats, like bacon, hot dogs, lunch meats. That could be things like refined carbohydrates, like chips, cookies, crackers, and other sweets, and other highly processed foods. Whereas a healthy diet would include more things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean meats in their more natural forms. We see physical inactivity, so lack of physical movement, and tobacco use as the major modifiable risk factors. And then, of course, there are some that we don't have any control over. One is our age. The older we get, the more likely we are to develop a chronic disease, though it's not inevitable. And heredity, so genes. Your genes do play a role in your risk of developing chronic conditions. Now, before these lead directly to chronic diseases, there are intermediary risk factors. So some things change in the body that then cause these major diseases or are indicative of these major diseases And that's why these often coincide. They're comorbidities, meaning that these conditions co-occur because they have similar underlying factors. So some of these underlying factors are raised blood pressure. So that this is called hypertension. If your blood pressure is high, that's putting more stress, more pressure on your heart and your blood vessels, which affects much of your body, which can lead to heart disease or stroke. We see that raised blood sugar levels are related to many of these chronic conditions, most notably diabetes. Abnormal blood lipids, which is often referred to as high cholesterol. This can cause an increase in plaque in your arteries, which we'll cover in just a minute. That can contribute to all of these. And then overweight or obesity is related to many of these as well. So the excess weight can change your hormonal functioning. It can put more stress on your internal organs and on your joints and other tissues and lead to the development of certain chronic diseases as well. It also can cause inflammation. And when you hear the word inflammation, that's a big key here. All of these chronic diseases are related to some level of systemic inflammation. So let's talk a little bit more about that. What exactly is inflammation? When we hear that word, we usually think, "Ooh, bad. I don't want to be inflamed." However, our body has an inflammatory response for a reason. There is an appropriate time and place for inflammation, and that is called acute inflammation, meaning inflammation that occurs in a short time window when it's needed and then goes away. And this typically occurs in response to an injury or some sort of pathogen, virus, bacteria that your body's trying to fight off. And it involves warmth, redness, swelling, and heat. And this is because all of these immune factors are coming into the area to, let's say you sprained your ankle. You might notice that it's hot to the touch. It gets big and puffy and swollen. It might be red or warm. And that's because all of these immune factors are rushing to this area to help heal it, move the healing process along, and to immobilize it so you stay off of it for a little bit. Same thing with a fever. If you're sick and you develop a fever, that's a sign that your body's trying to fight off those pathogens. Pretty cool, huh? So that's short-term inflammation. Chronic or long-term inflammation is when your immune system that's responsible for this inflammatory response is constantly perceiving threat or attack. So let's go back to the sprained ankle or the virus examples. When you sprain your ankle, your body says, uh-oh, attack, there's an issue here. When you have a cold or a flu, your body says, uh-oh, attack, I need to mobilize an immune response to react. However, if your body is sensing these chronic or persistent attacks, low-level attacks of the system, it will constantly pump out these excessive immune factors, which is bad for a variety of reasons. It leads to the things like high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high cholesterol, which brings us to these chronic conditions. And it also robs your body of the energy to carry out other important functions. So this chronic inflammation is related or underlying in the development of all of these chronic lifestyle diseases. So you can see here another kind of graphic or way to think about this is the environmental and behavioral factors, things like chemicals and UV radiation or pollution that you're exposed to, social, economic, and education status, the diet, the foods that you eat, we talked about, physical activity, your stress level, sleep, and other substance use can all impact your systemic chronic inflammation, which contribute to the development of our leading causes of death in the United States and global around much of the world. So again, things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancers, even some autoimmune diseases. So it's these behaviors, these lifestyle behaviors that cause inflammation in the body. And the reason is these foods that our body doesn't really know what to do with, foods that don't look like they exist in nature, or constant stress, or lack of sleep. All of these things are a stressor to our body, to our system, or chemicals, or pollution, or increased temperatures and the systemic changes that come with that. All of these things are a stressor to our system, and our body responds by ramping up the inflammatory response, that inflammatory immune response, which it wants to do to help us, but it goes unchecked, causing damage in the body and leading to the development of these chronic diseases. So you can see how, in some ways, this is worrisome because these behaviors and these things that are exposed to can lead to many, many conditions that will negatively impact our health and eventually cause death. However, this can also be used to our advantage because the same behaviors that can help reduce the risk of one disease can help reduce the risk of most of them. So let's continue. We're going to look more deeply now at cardiovascular diseases. That's because this is the leading cause of death in the United States, and there are quite a few different diseases that we'll cover here that fall under this branch. So cardiovascular diseases encompass all diseases and conditions that impact the heart and blood vessels, your cardiovascular system. Nearly half of adults in the United States, 48%, have some form of cardiovascular disease right now, with hypertension or high blood pressure being the most common. And heart disease and strokes combined, which again, strokes impact the brain, but are a condition of the blood vessels. These account for 1/3 of all deaths in the United States. So these are a pretty big deal. Looking again at underlying causes, we go back to inflammation, which in this case is related to the development of plaque in the arteries. And you'll recall that arteries are part of your cardiovascular system that transport blood away from the heart, and then veins are blood vessels that bring blood back towards the heart. So these various lifestyle and genetic conditions can contribute to the development of plaque. And you've probably heard this term before if you've seen a commercial about high cholesterol, or maybe even when you've gone to the dentist and they say you have plaque in your teeth. That's the same kind of plaque in your blood vessels, which is actually why dental hygiene is really important for cardiovascular health. Go figure. So you'll see an example of some beautiful arteries on the right here. A healthy artery is fluid, pliable. It's not too stiff. It's strong and elastic, and it's got this nice space in between for blood, oxygen, and other nutrients to easily flow through. And as plaque develops, it takes up more and more space in those blood vessels. This is a process known as atherosclerosis. So the development of plaque within the blood vessels, and that atherosclerosis causes our blood vessels to become narrow, so there's less space to move through, stiff, and lose their pliability. This is not good for our health. If you think about a bunch of garden hoses running through your body, transporting all the fluid and nutrients around and oxygen, you want it to be nice and pliable. Think about if you had a hose that you put a rock in, or you pinched it so there was a kink and there was only a little bit of space to get through. What's going to happen to the water flowing through that hose? Well, pressure is going to build up. So pressure is going to build up behind that blockage, and then it's going to spurt through it really hard as it comes out and spray everywhere. This can damage the blood vessels and our heart and the other areas of our body that it interacts with, like the brain in the case of a stroke, over time. And now these plaques develop from the accumulation of things like cholesterol in the blood, and this can lead to things like high blood pressure and our resultant cardiovascular disease outcomes. It also limits our body's ability to bring oxygen to our tissues that we need around our body. So it can make our other organs and systems function more poorly. And we also can't remove carbon dioxide and other waste products as easily, which can lead to metabolic stress in our tissues. So inflammation, as it relates to the development of plaque, also known as atherosclerosis, is the underlying factor of all of the cardiovascular diseases. Well, most of the cardiovascular diseases that we're about to cover. So the two major ones are hypertension and high cholesterol. High blood pressure is the common name for hypertension, and high cholesterol is the common name for dyslipidemia, which is the fancy name for high cholesterol. And these things are often thought of as intermediary conditions. So they're not the outcomes that lead to death, like the heart attack, but they're the underlying factors, and they are considered cardiovascular diseases. They're just the early forms or the early indicators. So blood pressure, a little more detail about that, is that blood pressure measures the amount of pressure that's being exerted on your arterial walls. So you just saw a nice picture of the arteries here. It's the amount of pressure being exerted on them as the blood flows through. And there we go. two numbers that you'll get when you measure your blood pressure, a systolic and a diastolic number. So it's usually expressed as one number over the top of another. Systolic is the amount of pressure on your arterial walls when your heart is beating in a contraction. Diastolic is the amount when your heart relaxes. And cholesterol is a waxy-like substance that's manufactured in your body and found in food, and it's useful. We do need it for some things. It helps us build cell walls and many hormones, but too much of it in our body can contribute to heart disease because it builds up that plaque in our blood vessels. Now, the really important thing to know about high blood pressure and high cholesterol is you won't typically have any symptoms if you have these. So you might be walking around with really high blood pressure and high cholesterol and never know it until it leads to the development of some major life-threatening condition. And that's why checkups are key. So getting regular physical exams is crucial for checking these basic numbers. There are lifestyle changes, and even in certain cases, as needed, there are medications that can help. Sorry, it's giving me a hard time changing the page here. There we go. So let's look a little bit at what normal and abnormal blood pressure and cholesterol values look like. So the most recent American Heart Association guidelines suggest that blood pressure, normal healthy blood pressure, is under 120/80. That used to be kind of like the normal range. Now they want it underneath that. So 120 milligrams of mercury when your heart is, or I'm sorry, millimeters of mercury when your heart is contracting, and 80 or less than 80 millimeters of mercury when your heart is relaxing. So if you've ever gone to the doctor and had them put the cuff around your arm, this is what they're measuring. So it's a great idea if you don't know your numbers to get this checked out. And you can actually do this at Mesa's Health Clinic for free. Just go in and say you'd like to have an appointment to get your blood pressure checked out. I think they also do cholesterol. And then you can see elevated as 120 to 129 and also less than 80. And then as those numbers start to rise, you move into high blood pressure stages 1, 2, or 3. If it's over 180 and over 120 for the diastolic, then you would want to seek immediate care if you were measuring your blood pressure on your own. And some people who have known high blood pressure will buy themselves a blood pressure cuff so they can check this on their own at home. Now, cholesterol, again, we said that's that waxy substance in the blood that can lead to the development of plaque, but it does have other important roles in the body, so we do need some. We want our total cholesterol to be under 200. That's desirable. Over 240 is considered high, and in between is borderline high. And you get this measured via a blood test. We have two primary types of cholesterol, LDL and HDL. LDL is smaller, stickier, and denser, and more likely to lead to the development of plaque, whereas HDL is bigger, less dense. Think of it like fluffier, and it doesn't lead to the development of plaque. In fact, it actually helps slough some of the plaque away and out of your arteries. So ideally, we want that LDL under 100, but really anything under 130 is good. Above that, we get into high and very high levels. And then the HDL, because it's good and helpful, we want that one to be higher, ideally over 60. So you won't necessarily memorize all of these. This is just kind of some information for you to know about blood pressure and cholesterol levels. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and define some of our other cardiovascular conditions. See you soon.